So it's important to understand the nature of totalitarian rule, since really for the first half, or at least a third of Soviet history, we can talk about totalitarianism. The two periods that we usually separate are pre-1956 totalitarian period and the authoritarianism that was sort of later from 1956 to 1991. One way to think about a dictatorship is that a dictator is out to rob as much as he can for himself and for his supporters. Power is nice because it delivers goods. Repression is used as a means to maintain power. Totalitarian leaders, by contrast, crave all-out power. And there are six major aspects of a totalitarian state. One is an official ideology to which general adherence is demanded, and the ideology is intended to achieve a perfect final stage of mankind. So here, obviously, we're talking about communism. If I cough long enough, it'll get better. And so the communist utopia that they were looking for. So once you had communism, the idea was that all the walls of the state would just disappear, all state institutions would disappear, and everyone would live perfectly happily and in harmony. Because there would be no fighting, no jealousy, no security issues, because everyone would have the same things. So that was the official ideology. A second aspect of totalitarianism is a single mass party, hierarchically organized and closely interwoven with the state bureaucracy, and typically led by one man. Not necessarily, but typically. This party is the one that pushes the ideology outwards upon the population. A totalitarian state also has monopolistic control of the armed forces. In other words, they don't have paramilitaries that support totalitarians. They do everything themselves. And a similar monopoly on the means of effective mass communication. There is no outside information that comes. All the information that people receive is written by or severely edited by the authorities. On top of this, you've got a system of terroristic police control. These are the knocks in the middle of the night when people are taken away from their apartments and brought out to prisons, and no one knows why. The whole point here is to shatter people, to shatter social ties, and destroy the horizontal ties between people that we'll talk about in a moment. And finally, you've got central control and direction of the entire economy. Everything goes back to the center. The center decides who gets what, how much of what color, what size, etc. So these are a totalitarian state. You have very few totalitarian states. We could talk about China under Mao as a totalitarian state, the Soviet Union under Stalin as a totalitarian state, and not a lot of others that actually meet this definition. Although people love to throw around the totalitarian label. I think Bush was called a totalitarian. I'm sure Obama's been called a totalitarian. That's just the way politics are. They aren't totalitarians. And most of the worst despots that you know of were also not totalitarians. So a major aspect of the totalitarian regime is to destroy what we call horizontal ties between people. And this is actually a horrible, these are the horizontal ties over here. So here's a good picture of what we mean by horizontal ties. It means Jack talks to Jenny, talks to Jerry, talks to Susie, talks to Janet, etc., etc., etc. And they create these various communities. So they come together in chess clubs and they talk about how the government's no good and how the streets aren't clean enough. They come together in political groups. They come together in various political and civil society relations, and they simply communicate with one another. And if you're in a sewing group or a reading group or something, or a soccer team, chances are things can come back to politics. You know, why are the streets so snowy and no one cleans them? Well, it's because our mayor's corrupt. Well, why is our mayor corrupt? Well, because the system, blah, blah, blah. So you can see where that goes. The whole point of totalitarianism is to erase these, destroy these horizontal ties so people don't talk to each other because they're afraid of each other. Jack's not going to talk to Susie because Susie might be an informer. And the same thing goes everywhere. And so what you end up having is, instead of these horizontal structures, which you have in a normal state, in a totalitarian state, they try to foment these what we call vertical relationships. So Jack only listens to the center, right? Jack doesn't believe anyone except for the center. He certainly doesn't talk to anyone about his disagreements with the system or with the way things are happening or run, because his allegiance is to the center and not to one another anymore. The whole point here is to try to stave off any potential opposition. And it was very effective. So a note here on Soviet repression. I have a note here. Um, is that again totalitarianism really went from 1917, really the late 19 or mid 1920s, I guess, um, but arguably 1917, all the way up to 1956, and then you had authoritarianism. Now, still, the ideology existed in this authoritarian period after 1956. You had the zeal of the initial years, but the ideology never really went away. People didn't really necessarily believe it, but they still kept practicing it. You had the role of leadership in debunking the totalitarian state, thanks to Khrushchev and a special speech he made at the 20th Party Congress condemning Stalin. Um, you also had a consistent perceived threat. The people knew what the state was capable of, and they knew what they could talk about and what they couldn't. And so, even if the state wasn't totalitarian anymore, not a lot of people engaged in politics throughout the 1960s and 70s and 80s until Gorbachev launched this sort of liberalization. So this was control in the Soviet Union from state and nation to the individual. And now let's consider some of the general implications of the Soviet period. Um, so some of the good things that the Soviet Union did is they sought the quote unquote liquidation of illiteracy. Their goal was to eventually transcend divisive elements in society, nationality, and class. And so they tried to eliminate literacy and make it so that everybody could read about Marxism, read about how the state was functioning. All the information was state information, so that was good. So the effect, though, was that in Central Asia, you went from about a 5% literacy rate in 1917, which was down to around 0.5% in places like Kyrgyzstan, where you had highly nomadic peoples, to really universal literacy by the 1970s. Um, since independence, we've seen a fall a little bit from that again. But so the Soviet period did great things in terms of literacy. Unlike other post-colonial Islamic states, they did not have a very small group of educational elites, but they actually had a large percent of the population that was educated, homogeneously educated, and integrated into the state, but educated. In terms of the healthcare system, you had major investments in health in Central Asia. Life expectancies in Central Asia increased by decades, from 32 early on to about 70 by 1985. Central Asians were among the top 50 states in the world in the Human Development Index, or Human Development Report from the 1980s. So a huge change. In terms of infrastructure, railroads were built, paved roads. Railroads they started building them under Tsarism, but they were developed. So it wasn't just to serve the interests of the Russian Empire. Now it's to serve the interests of the Soviet Empire. They created paved roads going everywhere, airports, sewage systems, electricity, gas, transportation, hospitals, all these sorts of things were invested in. They also had centralized political control. They got things done, things that used to not get done. Remember when we talked about the Khanates, we were talking about these local structures that were constantly in a state of rebellion. They couldn't control their populations. Again, when the Russians were in charge, those areas that the Russians controlled under the military, and then later on the civilian administrators, they were just inefficient. They were wasteful. They were a bunch of drunks. And so you also didn't have the delivery. Here, you actually had a very strong system of getting things done, like constructing the roads and airports and sewage and all that. The Communist Party was also the road to upward mobility, and indigenous forms of the organization were often crippled, and people felt a need to buy into this new Soviet identity. And all this was in order to get things done. The bureaucracy was extensive, it was loyal, it was well trained. Doesn't mean if you wanted something done as a commoner, you would get things done. People would probably be drinking tea and ignoring you in the bureaucracy. But if someone at the top wanted something done, it would get done. You also had economic stability. I mean, the mantra of the day was, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. But people were generally fed, they were kept healthy, they had a free cradle-to-grave system of social services. They had significant mobility. People would go for free thanks to their local union, and the labor union was just a branch of the Communist Party, really. They would go on free vacations to Bulgaria, to the seaside, for example. And finally, they had the status of a superpower. And this was important. This is something that people really missed later on. They had the respect of much of the world. Um, Now, in terms of some of the bad things, I guess I could stay here and say, yeah, they had major illiteracy was reduced, but they used the education to control the population, to indoctrinate the population, to create a society of non-critical thinkers. The health system was accessible for everyone, but it was often substandard. Often you had to pay bribes in order to get the services you really needed. The infrastructure was much developed, but it was developed in a specific sort of plan. All roads eventually led to Moscow, not literally. You had shoddy quality of the infrastructure. I could always smell the bathrooms from wherever I was in a Russian or an Uzbek or a Kyrgyz, wherever I was. Whatever building I was in, I could always smell where the bathrooms were. I remember the airplane buckle on a Russian airplane that I actually had to tie together. I just tied a knot because they said, "Well, your buckle doesn't work, so tie a knot." So you still had, maybe for cultural reasons, you had the development of a sewage system, but many Central Asians are still using ditch toilets, whether they want to or not. And there could be a cultural element there. I remember, my host sister telling me that she didn't like getting splashed. She was using the bathroom side. But so the infrastructure was there, but it wasn't perfect. In fact, it was very far from perfect. It was quite shoddy, but it was much more developed than it had been ever before. In terms of political control, the bureaucracy was trained to run the state non-critically, and many parts of the repressive apparatus as well. So you had a local KGB, judiciary officials. They were up to no good. You also had strong ties to the media, existing social organizations, and even people who were brought into the local power political structures. In other words, they were co-opted or coerced into it. There was a lack of a true civil society. There were, again, these vertical over these horizontal ties destroyed, vertical ties facilitated. And there was this constant legacy of fear from the totalitarian period. But I want to go back to this last point, this economic stability, and talk a little bit about economics and centralized economy. The centralized economy was characterized by massive inefficiencies in Central Asia and all around the Soviet Union. Everything was directed by Moscow. There was a building in Moscow where production quotas were created, where transportation networks were decided. Everything having anything to do with the economy was decided by Moscow. Until the 1960s, the economy was largely oriented to the military-industrial complex. Later, there were more consumer goods, but there was no competition, so they were incredibly shoddy consumer goods. Horrible, awful consumer goods. TVs that would break within a couple months. Cars that you had to wait in line for 8 years for if you could afford it. They diversified production, as I mentioned before, so everyone would make a piece of something oftentimes. I gave you the case of the rocket. There was an airplane factory in Uzbekistan. And again, the engines were made in one place, the wings were made in another, the hull was made in another, the seats were made in another. And all these things had to come together in order to create the final product. And often this meant, factory managers talking to other factory managers, trying to get pieces. And we're not just talking about engines, we're talking about trying to make the engines and getting the pieces of metal you need to make the engines, getting the screws, all these sorts of things. A very complex web of getting the goods that you needed, which led the way to corruption. You also had quotas on everything. So you had to make a certain number of shoes. It didn't matter that sometimes you were selling pairs of shoes that were 2 left shoes or 2 right shoes. They didn't have to be a proper pair. You had to have enough boots that you produced. You also had poor coordination. You had empty store shelves at the same time as you had wagons, railway wagons filled with fruit and vegetables that were rotting on the railway tracks because they didn't get things to the places they were supposed to get on time. So all of these factors come together and create fertile ground for corruption. You have artificial production, in other words, what we call cooking the books. pretending we produced more than what we really did. Classic case of this, not in the Soviet Union, actually outside in another communist country in Poland, where I worked as a reporter. I talked to some farmers, and what the farmers were doing for fuels, they were actually siphoning fuel out of the ground because these particular farmers were right along a fence that separated them from what was it? It was an airfield used by the Air Force during the Communist period. Now, during the Communist period, the Soviets said, "Hey, you Warsaw Pact members," Warsaw Pact was the alliance they were in, like our NATO. You Warsaw Pact members, you have to fly a certain number of sorties per month, and so here's enough fuel to fly those. But the problem was they didn't have enough spare parts to actually fix the planes when they would get broken, and so they would have all this extra fuel because they couldn't get the planes up. And so instead of using that 500 pounds of fuel, and it's a random number, 500 pounds of fuel that month, they would have only used 200 pounds because that's as much as they could use, and the rest they had to dump somewhere. And so they would dump it into the fields, and then here we were in the early 1990s, farmers were actually siphoning it out and running their tractors on some sort of jet engine. They were super turbo-powered tractors, I guess. So again, this was one of the problems. You had a quota, but you didn't have enough parts to actually fulfill those quotas. So you had to use bribes or use connections to get those parts, or build the things without the proper parts. In which case, you had products that didn't really work very well. You had corruption throughout the entire system. You want something, you need to know somebody. To get the choice meat when meat's being rationed, you need to know somebody. To get imported wine, to get a new coat or a new pair of shoes, all these things. You need to get permission to change your address. You always have to pay a bribe. There was always money changing hands. You had major splits between elites, those connected to the Communist Party, in other words, and the non-elites, those who were not connected. So there was this heavy demand for Western goods, luxury items. I mentioned jeans and bubblegum. Those were very fashionable in the 1980s. Music, the Beatles were very popular. All this gives way to a huge underground economy. For a long time, you couldn't get toilet paper. People were using newspapers, which is a habit, it turns out, that dies hard. So you had to wait years for apartments. You had multi-generational apartments, lots of people stuffed into one room. You had long lines for, I mentioned the cars. They were really like go-karts, but they were technically cars. You had stores where you had these curtains, and if you were privileged, if you had connections, if you had access, if you were a member of the Communist Party, nomenklatura, a word you should know. Nomenklatura is this state elite. You could go behind the curtain and get all the good stuff. Well, in front of in the rest of the store, it was pretty much empty shelves or rotting food. So this is the way everything functioned. But people became accustomed to these state subsidies at the same time. Corruption was frequently accepted as a system. It helped offset artificially low wages and poor working conditions. Everyone used corruption. Everyone could sell things off. You could take some of the screws home from your work, and you could trade them for some meat or potatoes or sewing thread, so that you could sew some things. So there was monetary exchanges. There were in-kind rendering of services. All these things, ethnic networks, were supported by corruption, and this would have an important role in the economy. They created this second economy, this black or gray economy, which really enabled citizens to earn extra income and also helped alleviate shortages in goods and services, and probably helped perpetuate the Soviet system for even longer. Ethnic networks could also provide for upward mobility of local nationalities who might otherwise find this mobility much more difficult. So ethnic networks were actually stronger as a result of this. Maybe I shouldn't even go here yet. Hold on, let me go back. If you think about a Central Asian manager taking a cut at the factory, lots of things can come into play here. They could release that cut onto the local market. They could, or otherwise things that were destined for export might surface, like caviar was produced largely for export, but it would surface because people would steal it. They could attain income that would allow them to build an addition to their house, meaning more possibilities for side income for those whom he favors, or, so he would have to employ other people and give them money. It created its own economy, fairly complex yet quite simple. It was literally another economy that was taking place. Officially, elites really had a stake in all this corruption, getting to the last point here. Administrators would take cuts, and they wanted to see the status quo stay the way it was. They wanted to keep taking cuts, obviously. So political elites essentially found a stronger base by looking the other way. They found that they were stronger if they looked the other way and didn't crack down on corruption. This was especially the case during the Brezhnev years. They could take a cut if corruption was going on. If corruption wasn't going on, they couldn't take a cut, and people might become increasingly angry. This was a sort of event for the people. So it allowed the local masses, who were excluded from Russo-centric aspects of the economy, to find their own economic niche, and was this sort of, ethnic safety valve to a certain extent. So, looking at Soviet Central Asian economy, I've been going on for forever. I'll take a separate slide here.